Hannah Whitmore didn't cry when the lawyer slid the divorce papers across the polished oak table. The office overlooked Midtown Manhattan, all glass and steel, the kind of place where decisions were made quickly and regrets were buried quietly. Richard Hale sat across from her, relaxed, scrolling through his iPhone, as if this meeting were nothing more than a delayed lunch appointment. His signature was already on the last page. Clean, confident, final. "Just sign here," the lawyer said, clearing his throat. Hannah picked up the pen. No questions, no demands, no fight. She signed her name exactly as it had always been. Steady, precise, almost calm. Richard finally looked up, surprised. He had prepared himself for tears, for bargaining, for anger. Instead, he saw nothing, just a woman closing a door without slamming it. "That's it?" he asked, a faint smirk forming. "You're not going to say anything?" Hannah slid the papers back across the table. "No," she replied softly. The lawyer excused himself, sensing the shift in the air. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, the city moved on. Taxis honked. A siren wailed somewhere far below. Life continued, just not hers. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, almost kindly, "this is for the best. You'll figure something out." Hannah stood, picked up her coat and nodded once. "I'm sure I will." She walked out without looking back. In the elevator, her phone vibrated. Transaction declined, then another notification. Account access restricted. By the time she reached the lobby, her credit cards were useless. Her joint account, gone. And her access to the Park Avenue apartment, revoked. The life she had lived for 12 years disappeared in less than 5 minutes. Outside, the cold Manhattan air hit her face. She stood on the steps of the building, holding a single tote bag, the only thing she had taken with her. Around her, people rushed past in tailored coats and polished shoes, unaware that a woman had just been erased from her own life. Hannah took a slow breath. She didn't know it yet, but the silence she chose that morning was already setting something enormous in motion. Something that would return to Richard Hale faster and far more violently than he ever imagined. And it would begin with a phone call he never saw coming. By the time Hannah Whitmore reached Park Avenue, night had already settled over Manhattan, like a cold, indifferent blanket. The doorman didn't smile when he saw her. He didn't need to say anything either. The look in his eyes told her everything before she even reached the entrance. "I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore," he said gently, stepping slightly in her path. "Mr. Hale called ahead. Your access has been deactivated." Hannah stood there, the glass doors reflecting her face back at her. Calm, pale, unrecognizable. 12 years of marriage reduced to a sentence delivered by a man who had once greeted her every morning. "I just need to grab a few things," she said. The doorman shook his head. "Security will bring them down tomorrow." Tomorrow, as if she still had one. She turned away without arguing. She had learned, very quickly, that dignity was sometimes the only thing no one could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Richard. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll be fine." She stared at the screen until it went dark. Hannah walked, past boutiques glowing with warm light, past restaurants where couples laughed over wine, past a Starbucks where she watched a woman pay with a single tap of her phone. Something Hannah could no longer do. The city hadn't changed. Only her position in it had. Her tote bag cut into her shoulder as she crossed into Central Park. The benches were cold. The air smelled like damp leaves and distant traffic. She sat, finally, exhaustion seeping into her bones, now that there was nowhere left to pretend she was going. For the first time that day, her hands began to shake, not from fear, from the realization that she had been erased with intention. This wasn't collateral damage. It was strategy. Richard hadn't just wanted a divorce. He wanted her helpless, dependent, small enough to crawl back and apologize for existing without his permission. Hannah pressed her palms together, breathing slowly, the way she had learned years ago when panic threatened to swallow her whole. She didn't cry. She made a decision. If this was the bottom, then she would treat it like solid ground, something to stand on, not sink into. Her phone vibrated once more, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Whitmore," a calm male voice said. "This is Caleb Monroe. I don't know if you remember me, but we need to talk. Tonight." Hannah looked up at the dark skyline through the trees. Something in his tone told her this call wasn't an accident, and that whatever was coming next would change the direction of her life. Permanently. Now Richard Hale believed closure should feel lighter than this. The private dining room at the Plaza Hotel glowed with soft amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections of chandeliers overhead. Lydia Crow sat across from him, elegant and composed, her hand resting lightly on the white tablecloth, as if she already belonged there. This was the life Richard had chosen. Quiet luxury, controlled conversations, no emotional clutter. "To new beginnings," Lydia said, lifting her glass. Richard smiled and clinked it with his own. "To clarity." He didn't mention Hannah by name. He didn't have to. In his mind, she was already filed away under resolved matters. A woman who had chosen silence over resistance. A woman who would soon realize how fragile independence could be. "She didn't fight you?" Lydia asked carefully, though her eyes flickered with curiosity. "No," Richard replied, cutting into his steak. "She signed. No drama. No lawyers. No demands." Lydia's lips curved, satisfied. "Smart of her." Richard chuckled. "Naive," he corrected. "She's never understood how the world actually works." Around them, the restaurant hummed with restrained laughter and clinking silverware. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan shimmered, confident, untouchable. Richard felt aligned with it again, like a man who had corrected a mistake before it became a liability. His phone buzzed, a notification from his bank. He glanced down, expecting nothing more than a routine alert. Instead, his brow creased. Transfer pending. On hold. Richard frowned and refreshed the screen. Another notification followed, this one from his office. Compliance review scheduled. Immediate attendance requested. Annoyance flickered through him. Bad timing. He dismissed it with a tap, sliding the phone face down. "Work?" Lydia asked. "Always," he said, forcing a smile. "They can't function without me." But something subtle had shifted. The wine tasted sharper. The room felt smaller. And for the first time that evening, Hannah's face surfaced in his mind. Not pleading, not broken, but calm. Too calm. "She'll come back," Lydia said suddenly, almost offhand. "Women like her always do." Richard leaned back in his chair, confident. "If she does," he said, "it won't be on her terms." He didn't notice the way his phone vibrated again, or the name that appeared briefly on the screen before it went dark. Caleb Monroe. And he certainly didn't realize that while he sat there celebrating the end of one chapter, another had already begun. Quietly, deliberately, without his permission. Richard Hale thought the worst part was already behind him. He sat in a corner booth at a quiet restaurant near Fifth Avenue, the kind of place where conversations were low and privacy was guaranteed. The leather seats were soft, the lighting warm. Across from him, Lydia Crow checked her reflection in the darkened window, adjusting a strand of hair with the ease of someone who felt she had arrived exactly where she belonged. "So it's done," she said lightly. "No more loose ends." Richard nodded, lifting his glass. "Completely done." He didn't say Hannah's name. He didn't need to. In his mind, She was already part of the past, folded away like an old contract, no longer relevant to the future he was building. She had signed without resistance. That alone told him everything he needed to know. "She really didn't ask for anything?" Lydia asked, pretending curiosity. "No," Richard replied. "Not $1, not an explanation." Lydia smiled, the kind of smile that mistook silence for weakness. "I almost feel sorry for her," Richard laughed softly. "Don't. She chose this." Outside, traffic flowed steadily, headlights streaking past like proof that the world rewarded those who kept moving forward. Richard felt aligned with it again. Free. Unburdened. Certain. His phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at it, expecting a routine message from his assistant. Instead, he saw a notification from his bank. Transfer pending. Please contact your relationship manager. He frowned, irritation flashing briefly before he locked the screen. Always something, he muttered. Lydia leaned forward. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," Richard said, too quickly. "Just noise." But the feeling didn't fade. It settled somewhere beneath his confidence, quiet and unfamiliar. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the conversation, on Lydia's laughter, on the certainty that he was still the one in control. "She'll come back," Lydia said casually, swirling her wine. Women like her always do, when reality hits. Richard's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "If she does," he said calmly, "it'll be because she finally understands how things work." His phone buzzed again. This time he ignored it. He didn't see the missed call. He didn't see the name. Caleb Monroe. And he had no idea that while he sat there convinced he had won, the very foundation of his certainty was already beginning to shift. Silently, precisely, core and beyond his reach. Morning arrived without mercy. Hannah Whitmore woke to the sound of the city breathing around her, buses exhaling, footsteps passing, the distant hum of traffic that never asked who was hurting. She had slept on a friend's couch in Brooklyn, her tote bag tucked beneath her arm like something that could be stolen if she let go. She rose quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped into the bathroom. The mirror showed a version of herself she barely recognized. No makeup, no silk blouse, just tired eyes and a face stripped down to the truth. She straightened her shoulders anyway. By 9 a.m., Hannah was back in Manhattan, resume printed, portfolio saved on an old USB drive she'd almost thrown away years ago. She walked into the first office building with confidence she didn't feel, and I handed her documents to a young receptionist who smiled politely and promised a call. The call never came. The second interview was shorter. The third barely lasted 10 minutes. "We're looking for someone more current," one hiring manager said, eyes flicking to the gap in her work history. "You've been out of the industry for a while." Hannah nodded, thanked him, and left. By mid-afternoon, her feet ached. Her phone battery hovered near empty. Each polite rejection stacked neatly on top of the last, quiet but crushing. At a small cafe, she ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and sat by the window, watching people type furiously on laptops that mirrored the life she once had. She checked her email again. Nothing. Then, just as she was about to stand and leave, a new message appeared. A subject, invitation to discuss a consulting opportunity. She frowned, reading it twice. The company name meant nothing to her. Monroe Logistics Group. No flashy branding, no recognizable names. The message was brief, almost old-fashioned, requesting a meeting that evening. No salary mentioned. No promises made. Hannah hesitated. Every instinct told her to be cautious. She had been blindsided once already, but desperation had a way of softening fear, and something about the tone of the email felt intentional. She replied with a single word: available. As dusk settled over the city, Hannah stood outside a modest office building near the river. Nothing like the glass tower she was used to. The windows glowed softly, warm against the darkening sky. She took a breath and stepped inside. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that this interview wasn't a coincidence. It was a door reopening. And the man waiting on the other side remembered her far better than she remembered him. The office was quieter than Hannah expected. No glossy reception desk, no branded walls, just warm lighting, clean lines, and the steady confidence of a place that didn't need to impress anyone. She gave her name to the receptionist, who nodded and gestured down the hall without asking for identification. "He's been expecting you." That alone unsettled her. Hannah followed the corridor to a conference room overlooking the river. The windows were wide, unadorned, no skyline, no spectacle. A man stood near the table, his back to her, sleeves rolled up, studying a tablet as if time meant very little to him. "Ms. Whitmore," he said before she spoke, turning calmly. He was taller than she remembered, if she remembered him at all. Mid-40s maybe. Dark hair touched lightly with gray. His suit was well cut, but unremarkable, the kind worn by men who didn't measure their worth by labels. "Yes," Hannah replied carefully. "That's me." He smiled, not polite, not forced, genuine, almost relieved. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here," she said, choosing honesty over performance. "Fair," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Let me start by asking you something. 6 years ago, did you consult on a crisis rebrand for a regional shipping firm in Baltimore?" Hannah froze. "I did," she said slowly. "Pro bono. The company was about to collapse." The man nodded. "Everyone else told us to sell. You told us to restructure the narrative first." Her heart skipped. "You were there?" "I was," he said. "Under a different name." He extended his hand. "Caleb Monroe." The name meant nothing to her, yet something in his eyes told her it should. "You saved us millions," Caleb continued. "You refused payment. Said the company needed it more than you did." Hannah swallowed. "I don't even remember your face." "I never forgot yours," he said simply. Silence settled. Not awkward, but weighted, intentional. "I'm not offering charity," Caleb said, his tone shifting. "I'm offering opportunity. I need someone who sees systems, not egos. Someone who doesn't panic when power shifts." Hannah felt the edges of her exhaustion crack. "And what makes you think that's me?" she asked. Caleb held her gaze. "Because when everything was taken from you," he said quietly, "you didn't ask for it back. You stood up and kept walking." Hannah leaned back, breath shallow. For the first time since the divorce, something inside her didn't feel like loss. It felt like recognition. Hannah didn't agree right away. She left Caleb Monroe's office with more questions than answers, the evening air heavy against her skin as she walked toward the subway. The city felt different now. Not kinder, not softer, just alert, as if something had shifted beneath the surface and hadn't settled yet. Her phone buzzed before she reached the platform. A message from Caleb's assistant. "If you're still interested, a car will be downstairs in 20 minutes. Hannah stared at the screen. Interested wasn't the word she would have chosen. Cautious, curious, cornered. All of them felt closer to the truth. She had no job, no apartment, and no safety net. Opportunity didn't usually arrive wrapped in comfort. It arrived disguised as risk. She typed back a single line. "I'm listening." The car took her to a private terminal just outside the city. No crowds, no announcements, just quiet movement and controlled space. Hannah stepped out and froze when she saw the aircraft waiting on the tarmac, sleek, white, unmistakably private. "This is unnecessary," she said, stopping short. Caleb turned to her, calm as ever. "So is most fear," he replied. "But we manage it anyway." "I thought this was a conversation," Hannah said, "not a flight." "It is a conversation," he said, "just not one that belongs in New York." Inside the jet, everything felt muted. Soft leather seats, low lighting, the kind of luxury that didn't ask to be admired. Hannah sat stiffly, hands folded, every instinct telling her to stay alert. "You're not obligated," Caleb said once they were airborne. "We can turn around." She looked out the window as the city lights fell away. Manhattan shrank into something distant, manageable. "No," she said finally. "If I'm going to start over, I don't want to do it halfway." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. "Because what I'm about to ask you to do will make people uncomfortable." "Who?" Hannah asked. "Him," Caleb replied quietly. "And anyone who thought you were finished." The plane climbed higher, steady and unbothered by gravity. Hannah closed her eyes for just a second, letting the hum of the engines ground her. She didn't know where this flight would land. But for the first time since everything fell apart, she wasn't running. She was moving forward, on her own terms. The jet landed just after midnight. Hannah stepped onto the quiet runway, the air warmer, heavier, carrying a different kind of stillness. No cameras, no crowds, just a waiting car and the low hum of engines cooling behind her. She had expected questions, explanations, maybe even reassurance. Instead, Caleb said nothing. They drove in silence to a modern building overlooking the coast. Inside, the space was minimal. Glass walls, soft lighting, no art chosen for attention. Hannah noticed how everything felt intentional, as if nothing here existed by accident. Caleb finally spoke once they were seated across from each other at a long table. "I need to be clear," he said. "What I'm offering you isn't safe." Hannah folded her hands. Neither was my marriage." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed his face. "This project," Caleb continued, sliding a thin folder toward her, "will put you directly in the path of people who don't like surprises. People who believe leverage is more important than fairness." Hannah opened the folder slowly. The scope of the work made her chest tighten. International operations, financial restructuring, strategic oversight. It was far beyond the consulting role she had expected. "You're overestimating me," she said quietly. "No," Caleb replied. "I'm correcting the way others underestimated you." She looked up. "And if I say no?" "Then I'll respect it," he said without hesitation. "But I won't pretend I didn't see your potential just because it became inconvenient." Hannah leaned back, absorbing the weight of his words. For the first time, the risk became real. This wasn't a favor. It was a gamble, with consequences. "There's one condition," Caleb added, her muscles tensed. "I'm listening." "You don't get my protection," he said calmly. "Not publicly, not privately. You stand on your own. If this works, it's because of you. If it fails—" He paused. "It fails cleanly." Hannah stared at him, searching for manipulation, for hidden control. She found none. In that moment, she understood the true test wasn't the job. It was whether she trusted herself enough to take it. She closed the folder. "When do we start?" she asked. Caleb smiled, slow and deliberate. "We already have." Hannah didn't know it yet, but somewhere in Manhattan, Richard Hale was about to learn that silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The days that followed didn't feel dramatic. They felt heavy. Hannah woke before sunrise in the guest room overlooking the water, the ocean still dark, the house silent except for the distant rhythm of waves. There were no speeches, no grand reassurances. Just a schedule waiting on the desk, and a laptop already logged in with restricted access. This wasn't rescue. It was work. She spent the first morning reading contracts, shipping routes, financial summaries dense enough to blur together. Her eyes burned. Her shoulders ached. More than once, doubt crept in, whispering that this was all temporary, that she was standing in a space she didn't truly belong. By afternoon, she caught her reflection in the glass wall, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, posture different, straighter, more deliberate. She remembered who she had been before she became someone's wife. At night, exhaustion hit hard. Hannah sat alone with a mug of coffee gone cold, scrolling through notes she'd made years ago, ideas she'd never been allowed to finish. She didn't think about Richard, not consciously, but every decision she made felt like an answer to something he had once dismissed. On the third day, a secure email arrived, a document labeled Risk Exposure, Hale Capital Involvement. Her breath slowed as she opened it. Richard's firm wasn't just adjacent to the project, it was embedded in it. Hannah leaned back, pulse steady, mind racing. This wasn't coincidence. This was the collision Caleb had warned her about. The uncomfortable part. The part where people noticed she hadn't disappeared. She closed the file and opened another. Strategy. Not retaliation. Not emotion. Just clarity. Later that evening, Caleb stopped by the office. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't hover. He simply placed another folder on the table and waited. "I won't interfere," he said. "But you should know. They'll underestimate you." Hannah nodded. "They already have." Caleb watched her for a long moment. That's usually when the balance shifts. When he left, Hannah stayed behind, the building quiet again. She stood by the window, looking out at the dark water, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not anger, not fear. Momentum. Whatever Richard believed she had lost when she signed those papers, whatever power he thought he'd taken, it was becoming clear now. She hadn't given it up. She had carried it with her, and she was finally ready to use it. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Hannah learned that at 2:17 a.m., when a calendar alert slid onto her screen without ceremony, no explanation, no agenda, just a title that made her pause. Strategic Alignment, East Coast Expansion. She stared at it longer than necessary, then opened the attendee list. There it was. Hale Capital Partners. For a moment, the room felt smaller, not suffocating, focused. This was the collision she'd sensed, but hadn't named yet. The past hadn't chased her down. It had waited, positioned itself, and now stepped directly into her path. Hannah didn't close the invite. She opened her notes instead. By sunrise, she had mapped the structure of the deal, where Hale Capital held influence, where it overreached, and where it assumed silence meant consent. The pattern was familiar. Richard had always believed that if he spoke last, he won. She smiled once, without humor. In the conference room later that day, the screens lit up one by one. Executives, advisors, legal counsel. Faces composed, voices controlled. Hannah sat slightly back from the table, listening, letting others fill the space. No one acknowledged her. Good. When the discussion turned to logistics oversight, Hannah leaned forward. "There's an inefficiency in the transfer schedule," she said calmly. "One that exposes unnecessary risk." A pause. A man on the screen frowned. "And you are?" "Hannah Whitmore," she replied. No title, just her name. Silence stretched. Then another voice broke in, sharp, familiar. "That concern was already reviewed," Richard Hale said. "It's not an issue." Hannah met the screen, her expression neutral. "It is," she said evenly. "And I can prove it." She shared her screen. Data flowed. Clear, precise, Undeniable, though not aggressive, not defensive, just accurate. The room shifted. Questions followed. Then more. The conversation tilted, subtly but decisively, away from Richard's certainty and toward Hannah's clarity. When the meeting ended, no one spoke for a moment. Then Caleb's voice came through, steady and final. We'll proceed with Hannah's recommendations. The call disconnected. Hannah closed her laptop, hands steady. Somewhere in Manhattan, Richard stared at a dark screen, realizing too late that the woman he thought he had erased had just rewritten the terms. And this time, she hadn't raised her voice once. Richard Hale didn't sleep that night. By morning, his confidence had thinned into something brittle, sharp around the edges. He arrived at his office early, Manhattan still waking outside the glass walls, coffee untouched on his desk. The meeting replayed in his head on a loop, not the data, not the objections, but the voice. Hannah's voice, calm, unapologetic, certain. She hadn't attacked him. That was the part he couldn't shake. No bitterness, no emotion, just precision. It felt worse than confrontation. It felt like replacement. His phone buzzed before 8. Emergency partners meeting. Attendance required. Richard exhaled slowly and stood, straightening his jacket like armor. He had survived worse than this. One consultant didn't dismantle a firm. One woman didn't rewrite a decade of leverage. The boardroom was already full when he entered. No greetings, no small talk. The mood was surgical. On the screen at the far end of the room, a familiar presentation deck waited, this time with Hannah's name in the corner. Not large, not emphasized, simply present, ironed like a fact no one could argue with. A senior partner cleared his throat. We've identified several exposure points in the East Coast expansion, Richard leaned forward, which we've already addressed. Actually, another voice cut in. We haven't. Data followed. Numbers Hannah had flagged. Risks she had named. Decisions Richard had dismissed, now reframed as negligence. Each slide tightened the room, drawing the focus away from him inch by inch. This puts us in a compromised position, someone said, and raises questions about oversight. Richard felt the air shift, not hostile, worse, evaluative. He spoke carefully. We're reacting to hypotheticals. A pause. They're no longer hypothetical, the chair replied. They're documented. Silence landed hard. Outside, the city moved as always. Inside, Richard understood something he had never learned in all his years of control. Power didn't announce when it left. It simply stopped responding. The meeting ended without resolution, but with consequences implied. Committees formed, reviews scheduled, authority redistributed. As Richard gathered his things, his phone lit up with a single notification. Access revised. Pending review. For the first time, the words didn't belong to Hannah. They belonged to him. And somewhere far from that room, Hannah Whitmore continued her work uninterrupted, unaware that the man who once decided her worth was now being measured by standards he could no longer manipulate. The accusation didn't come directly. That was how Hannah knew it was intentional. It arrived as a forwarded memo late that afternoon, buried beneath routine correspondence. Its language carefully neutral, but sharp enough to draw blood. Potential conflict of interest. Prior personal relationship. Need for clarification. Hannah read it once, then again. Richard's name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. The implication was clear. Her presence in the project wasn't the result of competence, but coincidence. Or worse, favoritism. She closed the document without reacting. Across the room, analysts moved quietly, unaware of the shift happening just beneath the surface. Hannah didn't look up. She didn't defend herself. She didn't send an email or request a meeting. That was the mistake they expected her to make. Instead, she worked. She pulled timestamps, archived emails, old contracts, decisions made years ago, long before Caleb Monroe's name meant anything to her. She traced the logic of every recommendation she'd given, every risk she'd flagged, every solution she'd proposed. Facts, stacked carefully, were louder than outrage. By evening, another message arrived, this one from legal. "We'll need a statement." Hannah exhaled slowly, then replied, "You'll have documentation instead." Caleb stopped by just after sunset. He didn't ask what she was doing. He saw it in the way her desk was arranged, methodical, controlled, deliberate. "They're testing you," he said quietly. "I know," Hannah replied. "They want me to explain myself. And you won't." She looked up at him then. "No, I'll show them." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "If this goes wrong, it won't," she said calmly. "Because I didn't come here to be protected. I came here to be accurate." That night, Hannah uploaded a single file to the secure system. No commentary, no emotion, just evidence. The response came faster than she expected. The memo was withdrawn, the language revised, the concern reframed as resolved. No apology followed. None was needed, because the message had landed exactly where it was meant to. Hannah shut down her computer and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere in Manhattan, Richard Hale believed he was tightening the net. He didn't yet understand that every move he made was only confirming what Hannah already knew. Silence, when chosen carefully, didn't weaken a position. It fortified it. Richard Hale made his next move too quickly. From his perspective, the situation still felt manageable. The memo had been withdrawn, yes, but not because Hannah was innocent. In his mind, it was because she was being shielded, protected. He told himself that influence still bent in his direction, that power rarely vanished overnight. So he pressed. The invitation went out under the guise of efficiency. A private strategy session, limited attendance, no formal minutes. Richard framed it as an opportunity to align narratives before regulators asked harder questions. The wording was careful, polite, almost cooperative. Hannah received the invite and understood immediately. This wasn't reconciliation. It was bait. She arrived early, notebook in hand, expression unreadable. The room was smaller than the boardroom. Glass walls, a long table, no screens turned on yet. Richard entered last, jacket perfectly tailored, confidence practiced and intact. "Hannah," he said, nodding once. "I didn't expect you to accept." "I didn't want to be misunderstood," she replied calmly. That almost made him smile. The conversation started predictably. Richard spoke in generalities, shared responsibility, mutual oversight, the need to present a unified front. He never accused her outright. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air like a suggestion waiting to be agreed to. "We all make mistakes," he said, voice smooth. "What matters is how we correct them." Hannah listened, took notes, let him continue. Then, halfway through his explanation, she looked up. "Just to be clear," she said, "are you stating that I had decision-making authority before my official appointment?" Richard hesitated. Just a fraction. "In practice," he said, "you had influence." Hannah nodded. "And are you suggesting that influence compromised compliance?" Another pause. "I'm saying regulators might interpret it that way," he replied. That was all she needed. Hannah closed her notebook and stood. "Thank you," she said. "I'll forward the recording." The color drained from his face. "Recording?" She met his eyes evenly. This meeting was logged and approved by legal. Full transcript, time-stamped. Silence snapped into place. Richard understood then, not just that he had miscalculated, but how thoroughly. He hadn't cornered her. He had documented himself. Hannah gathered her things and walked toward the door. "You're right about one thing," she said without turning back. "Regulators do care how mistakes are corrected." The door closed behind her, and for the first time, Richard Hale realized he wasn't being attacked, and he was being preserved, carefully, permanently, on record. Lydia Crow sensed the shift before anyone warned her. It started with silence, the kind that followed her emails without explanation, the kind that lingered after meetings ended early. Invitations slowed. Calls went unanswered. The world she had stepped into with such confidence began to close its doors one by one. She told herself it was temporary. Richard had always said this phase would be messy, that people would hesitate before accepting her. She repeated his words like reassurance, even as her name disappeared from guest lists and her calendar emptied without reason. Then the message came. Not from Richard. From compliance. "We require clarification regarding your involvement in several transactions connected to Hale Capital." Lydia read it twice, then a third time, so her pulse tightening with each word. Transactions, involvement, clarification. These weren't accusations, but they were close enough to feel dangerous. She called Richard immediately. Voicemail. She texted. No response. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through old messages, replaying conversations that had once felt flattering, strategic, important. Only now did she see how often he had asked her to handle things quietly, to move introductions, to smooth narratives. She hadn't questioned it then. Why would she? She had trusted him. The next morning, her access badge didn't work. At the front desk, the receptionist avoided her eyes. "Your credentials have been suspended pending review." "Review of what?" Lydia asked, voice tight. "I'm not authorized to say." By the time she stepped back outside, her phone buzzed with a notification she couldn't ignore. "Your contract has been terminated, effective immediately." No meeting. No explanation. No Richard. Something inside her snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. She hadn't been chosen. She had been positioned, used where discretion mattered, discarded when exposure became inconvenient. Lydia opened her laptop and began organizing files she had never meant to revisit. Emails, calendars, call logs, not out of revenge, but survival. Across the city, Richard Hale believed he still controlled the narrative. He didn't yet realize that the woman he had underestimated twice, once as a wife, once as a convenience, was no longer the only one holding receipts. And when Lydia finally looked up from her screen, her hand steady, her expression resolved, she understood something with painful precision. But she had been collateral. But collateral could still detonate. The gala returned to the Plaza Hotel like nothing had changed. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, casting warm light over tailored suits and measured smiles. Champagne flowed. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like another flawless evening among Manhattan's elite. Richard Hale arrived precisely on time. He wore confidence the way he always had, pressed, deliberate, convincing. The whispers that had followed him for weeks softened in his presence. People still shook his hand, still listened when he spoke. Power, he believed, only disappeared if you acknowledged it had. Across the room, Hannah Whitmore entered quietly. No announcement, no dramatic pause. She wore a simple black dress, nothing designed to draw attention, yet conversations stalled as she passed. Not because of spectacle, but recognition. She no longer looked like someone trying to belong. She looked like someone who already did. Richard saw her then. The moment stretched. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Calculation replaced ease. He turned away first. The program began. Speeches followed. Applause landed on cue. Then a name appeared on the screen behind the stage. Special acknowledgement. Strategic leadership contribution. Hannah's name followed. The room shifted. Caleb Monroe stepped forward, voice calm, unhurried. This expansion wouldn't exist without clarity under pressure, he said, and that clarity came from someone who refused to confuse influence with entitlement. Applause broke out, measured at first, then steady. Richard remained still. And he felt it then, not embarrassment, not anger, but displacement. The realization that the room no longer centered around him, that authority had moved quietly, without confrontation, and left him standing exactly where he always had, only now alone. As the applause faded, phones buzzed discreetly across the room. Compliance updates, board notifications, meeting requests marked urgent. Richard checked his screen once, then again. His name appeared in messages he hadn't been copied on. Across the ballroom, Hannah met his gaze for a brief second. There was no triumph there, no accusation, only finality. The gala continued. Music resumed. Conversations restarted. But for Richard Hale, the evening had already ended. Because in that room, full of witnesses, full of silence, he understood what he had lost. Not his marriage, not his control, but the belief that he was untouchable. And that belief, once broken, never came back the same. The call came the next morning. Richard Hale recognized the number immediately. The board's private line, rarely used, never casual. He answered on the second ring, already standing, tie loosened, the remnants of last night's confidence still clinging to him like habit. "Richard," the chair said, voice even, "we need to speak. Now." By the time he arrived, the room was full, not crowded, complete. Legal counsel, compliance officers, 2 partners he hadn't seen in weeks, no pleasantries, no wasted time. A folder sat in front of every seat, identical, thick, and unmistakably prepared. Richard took his place, spine straight. The chair didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Following recent disclosures," he said, "after we've conducted an internal review." Richard nodded once. "I assumed as much." "Good," the chair replied. "Then you'll understand why we're restructuring oversight immediately." The word landed heavier than any accusation. Slides appeared on the screen. Recorded meetings, timeline correlations, decisions flagged, then traced back. Not to Hannah, not to Caleb, but to Richard's unilateral approvals, his pressure, his insistence. "This isn't about intent," Legal said calmly. "It's about exposure." Richard opened his mouth to respond. "Before you do," the chair interrupted, "this isn't a debate." Silence followed, not hostile, not angry, decisive. Effective immediately, Richard's authority was reduced. Committees replaced autonomy. Signatures required countersignatures. Access adjusted pending external review. The language was clinical. The result was not. Richard felt it then, the moment control became conditional. Not revoked. Not yet. But no longer assumed. When the meeting ended, no one lingered. As he gathered his things, his phone buzzed. Role adjustment confirmed. Pending further evaluation. He stared at the screen, breath shallow. Across town, Hannah Whitmore reviewed the same update from a different angle. Not with satisfaction, with closure. The system had done what systems were meant to do. Correct imbalance without spectacle. Caleb stopped by her office later that afternoon. "It's done," he said simply. Hannah nodded. "Then we move forward." He studied her. "You could have said more, at the gala, at the meeting." "I didn't need to," she replied. "The truth speaks when it's ready." That evening, as the city settled into itself once more, Richard Hale sat alone in his office, understanding something he had never believed before. Power didn't vanish in flames. It dissolved, quietly, officially, and beyond negotiation. Richard Hale waited longer than he should have. Pride told him to let the dust settle, to allow time to dull the edges of what had happened. Fear told him something else, that if he didn't speak now, the space between him and Hannah would harden into something permanent. He chose fear. The message he sent was short, controlled, almost formal. We should talk. For closure. Hannah read it an hour later. She didn't feel anger or satisfaction. Just distance, the kind that comes after a door has already been closed and locked from the inside. Still, she agreed. Not because she owed him anything, but because unfinished things had a way of lingering if left unspoken. They met in a quiet cafe near the river, neutral ground, no history embedded in the walls. Richard arrived early. He stood when she approached, a reflex he hadn't used in years. "Hannah," he said. She nodded once and sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the water moved steadily past the windows, indifferent to the tension inside. "I didn't expect things to go this far," Richard said finally. "That's true," Hannah replied. "You didn't," he exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I thought you'd come back. I thought, when reality hit, you'd realize you needed stability." Hannah met his eyes, calm. "I did realize something," she said. "Just not what you expected." He hesitated. "I underestimated you." "Yes," she agreed, "you did." The simplicity of it unsettled him more than accusation ever could. "I never meant to destroy you," he added quickly. Hannah tilted her head slightly. "You didn't destroy me. You revealed me." That stopped him. She continued, voice even. "You took things you thought I needed, money, access, status. What you didn't take was my ability to choose." Richard looked down, the weight of the words settling in. "I'm not here to punish you," Hannah said, "or forgive you." "Then why are you here?" he asked quietly. She stood, gathering her coat. "So you don't mistake my silence for regret." Richard watched her walk away, understanding too late that this was the moment he had truly lost. Not his position, not his reputation, but the last opportunity to be relevant in her life. Hannah stepped back into the city, the conversation already behind her. Some endings didn't need agreement. They only needed acceptance. Hannah didn't tell anyone when she left. No announcement, no farewell messages, just a quiet calendar block and a single packed suitcase. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, she was already on the way to the private terminal outside the city, watching the skyline fade behind tinted glass. The jet waited on the runway, engines idle, patient. Caleb stood near the stairs, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed. He didn't ask why she'd agreed so quickly. He didn't ask what she was leaving behind. He understood that some decisions didn't need witnesses. "You sure?" he asked as she approached. Hannah nodded. "I am." Inside the cabin, the air was calm, insulated from the world below. No screens, no noise, just space. Hannah took a seat by the window, resting her forehead lightly against the cool glass as the plane began to move. As they lifted off, Manhattan revealed itself one last time. Steel and light, ambition layered over memory. This city had taken from her. It had also shaped her, but it no longer defined her. Caleb sat across from her, not intruding on the moment. "You don't have to come back," he said quietly. "Not if you don't want to." "I know," Hannah replied. "That's why I can." He studied her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Most people think freedom looks loud." Hannah smiled faintly. "It's quieter than that." They reviewed plans mid-flight, not escape routes, expansion strategies, new offices, new teams, places where her name would be attached to decisions, not explanations. Hours later, the jet descended toward the coast. Sunlight spilled across the cabin, warm and unforced. Hannah felt something settle into place. Not excitement, not relief, but certainty. When the wheels touched down, she exhaled. This wasn't running. It was choosing. As they stepped onto the tarmac, Hannah glanced back once, not at the plane, but at the direction they'd come from. There was no longing there, no unfinished thought, only distance, earned, intentional, complete. Caleb paused beside her. "There's something else," he said. "I didn't bring you here just for work." She met his gaze, steady. "I assumed that," he smiled. "Good, because I wasn't planning to rush you." Hannah looked out at the open horizon, the future unshaped and waiting. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was rebuilding. She felt like she had arrived. Time didn't change everything at once. It worked quietly, the way real change always did. Weeks turned into months. Hannah settled into a rhythm that didn't revolve around reaction or defense. Mornings began early, not out of urgency, but choice. She walked along the coastline before work, letting the sound of the water clear her head before stepping into decisions that mattered. Her role expanded naturally, not through announcements, but through trust. Teams began to look to her for direction, not because she demanded authority, but because she listened, then spoke with clarity when it counted. Caleb never rushed her. That was the most disarming part. He didn't frame opportunities as favors. He didn't blur the line between partnership and expectation. When they worked late, they worked. When they shared meals, it wasn't strategy. It was conversation. About books, about places they'd never been, about mistakes they didn't regret anymore. One evening, after a long day, Hannah found herself sitting on the balcony outside her office, the sky darkening slowly. Caleb joined her, handing over a cup of coffee without asking. "You've changed things here," he said. "So have you," Hannah replied. He smiled slightly. "I was referring to the work." "I wasn't." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. Hannah thought about the woman she'd been when she signed the divorce papers, the version of herself that believed endurance was the same as strength, that believed silence meant disappearance. She knew better now. Silence, when chosen, created space. And in that space, something had grown. Not dependence, not rescue, but mutual recognition. Later that night, as they walked back inside, Caleb stopped. "There's no pressure," he said, "and no expectation." Hannah met his eyes. "I know. I just wanted you to understand," he continued, "that whatever this becomes, it only becomes it if you want it to." She considered that for a moment, then nodded. "That's the only way I'd accept it." They didn't define anything. They didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the label. It was the certainty that Hannah had built a life where choice was no longer a luxury. It was the foundation. And for the first time, love wasn't something she hoped would survive her strength. It was something that respected it. The ceremony was small by design. No press, no guest list curated for optics. Just a handful of people who had earned their place in Hannah's life through consistency rather than proximity to power. The venue sat quietly along the coastline, understated and open to the horizon, as if it had been chosen to remind everyone present that nothing here needed to be proven. Hannah arrived early, standing alone for a moment before anyone noticed. She wore a simple dress, tailored but unembellished, the kind chosen for comfort rather than effect. There were no nerves, only a steady calm she hadn't felt the first time she had promised her life to someone. This time, she wasn't stepping into a role. She was honoring a choice. Caleb waited near the front, hands relaxed at his sides. When he saw her, he didn't straighten or adjust himself. He simply smiled, the expression unguarded and rare. Not ownership, not relief. Recognition. The vows were brief, honest. They spoke of respect before love, of partnership before passion, of choosing each other not because they were needed, but because they were wanted. When it was over, and there was no applause, just quiet smiles, a few tears, and the sense that something solid had been set into place. Later that evening, as guests drifted away, Hannah stood at the edge of the terrace, watching the sky fade into deeper shades of blue. Caleb joined her without interrupting her thoughts. "Any regrets?" he asked lightly. She shook her head. "Only that I didn't believe this kind of peace was possible sooner." Caleb followed her gaze. "You had to build it first." Back in Manhattan, Richard Hale read about the marriage days later. Not in headlines, but through an industry update he almost skipped. Hannah's name appeared alongside a new venture, her role clearly defined. No mention of him. No footnote tying her success to his past. He stared at the screen longer than he meant to. What unsettled him wasn't the marriage. It was the absence. Hannah hadn't risen to prove him wrong. She had risen because she no longer needed to. As the evening settled and the lights along the coast flickered on, Hannah took Caleb's hand, feeling the quiet certainty of a life earned rather than borrowed. She hadn't been rescued. She had been rewarded by her own courage, her own restraint, and the strength to walk away long enough to find something better waiting. The final flight left just before dawn. Hannah sat by the window of the private jet, watching the runway lights blur into thin lines as the plane began to move. The cabin was quiet, not solemn, settled. Caleb sat a few rows away, reading without pretense, giving her space he no longer needed to prove he could give. As the jet lifted into the air, the city receded beneath a veil of early morning haze. Manhattan looked smaller from this height. Not insignificant, just complete. A chapter that no longer required revisiting. Hannah didn't think about Richard. That, more than anything else, felt like the truest ending. Weeks later, the fallout became public. Hale Capital announced leadership restructuring, advisory roles reassigned, authority redistributed. No scandal headlines, no dramatic takedown. Just a slow, unmistakable decline in relevance. Richard's name appeared less often. When it did, it was accompanied by cautious language and reduced influence. He watched it happen from the inside. The world hadn't turned against him. It had simply moved on. Hannah, meanwhile, moved forward. Her work expanded internationally. Her reputation followed, not as a survivor, not as someone's former wife, but as a strategist known for composure under pressure. She spoke when necessary, listened always. Power met her, not with resistance, but with recognition. One evening, months later, Hannah stood on a balcony overlooking open water, the air warm and still. Caleb joined her, resting his hand lightly against hers. There was no announcement, no milestone being marked. Just presence. "You know," he said, "some people mistake silence for absence." Hannah smiled faintly. They always have. She thought back to the woman she had been the day she signed those papers. Calm, quiet, underestimated. She hadn't known then what that silence would grow into. She knew now. It had become leverage, then clarity, then freedom. Richard Hale would never understand how thoroughly he had lost, not because he was punished, but because he was no longer part of the story that mattered, and Hannah didn't need vindication. She had peace. She had purpose. She had love chosen freely, not demanded. The jet waited in the distance, ready for the next departure. Hannah turned away from the view and stepped back inside, toward a life no longer shaped by what she endured, but by what she had built. Silence had never been her weakness. It had been her final advantage. So, the story comes to a close here. And if you're still with us right now, truly still here, then something in this journey must have touched your heart in its own quiet way. Maybe it wasn't the private jet, or the downfall, or even the love story at the end. Maybe it was the silence, the way Hannah chose dignity over noise, patience over panic, and self-respect over revenge. There's a lesson here that applies far beyond this story. Life doesn't always reward the loudest voice or the fastest reaction. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Hannah didn't control what was taken from her. She controlled how she responded, and that changed everything. Healing doesn't look dramatic in real life. Often, it looks like quiet mornings, hard work, and choosing not to explain yourself to people who already decided not to understand you. It looks like walking away without applause and trusting that peace is worth more than being right. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength or helped you see your pain from a new angle, then you're not alone. And we'd love to keep sharing stories like this with you. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps this space continue to grow and helps more hearts feel a little less alone. This story is a work of fiction created for storytelling and emotional reflection purposes only. While it draws inspiration from real-life emotions, challenges, and personal growth many people experience, all characters, events, organizations, and situations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, companies, or actual events is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended to explore themes such as resilience, self-respect, healing, and personal transformation, not to present factual claims, financial advice, legal guidance, or real-world guarantees of success. Viewers should understand that outcomes in real life vary based on individual circumstances. This content is designed to inspire thoughtful reflection and emotional connection, not to mislead or represent real individuals or institutions. By engaging with this story, viewers acknowledge it as fictional storytelling meant for entertainment, personal insight, and motivational discussion only.